Good afternoon. I'm Donna Rhodes. I'm a principal research scientist at MIT. And an open area of research in my group is model curation. And it's really a growing area of interest in the systems community. Model curation is a huge subject.
Try again.
Shall I take it?
You're fine. Go ahead.
Okay. So model curation is really a huge subject, and so in putting together a very small talk, what I thought I would like to do is focus on a particular theme regarding curation, which is really how it influences model duration. Models, a huge spectrum of interest, and clearly we have some models that are intended to just enrich our thinking, help us work out a problem, sketch things out. These are the types of models that end up in our desk drawer. These are the models that are really not applicable when we talk about model curation. So what is model curation? Here's a working definition of model curation that's been formulated from our research around what is going on in curation in multiple fields. And there are a couple of key points around this. First of all, model curation is about life cycle management, control, and preservation. And a very key point that differentiates model curation from something like curation of an institutional collection, like a museum, is that in model curation, there's really active enhancement going on. We care very much not only about having a repository of models, but having those being actively enhanced so that these can ensure value for current and future use. And that future use includes repurposing models beyond what their initial purpose and context was. So when we think about a model and a model that we want to withstand the test of time, duration is a key property of that, but there are many other different properties that model curation cares about. These are all very entangled properties, and some of them are listed here. But a model that is not trusted, that is not credible, and so forth, is not going to be a model that we want to keep around in our repositories. So these are all very interlinked properties. So shorter duration models, as I said, are those quick and dirty, the ones where we're working things out, we're sketching. And then longer term models, longer duration models are those that are really going to be used throughout major parts of the life cycle, perhaps even into operations. So curation alone helps us to differentiate what models are intended to be shorter duration models and which ones should have a longer lifespan. One of the key activities involved in curation is called model accessioning. Accessioning is a really important part of performing curation because curation is about establishing an enterprise-level collection of models. And so the question is then, of all those models that we create that are of different forms and types and purposes, which ones will then be, by intent, elevated up into a formal collection, a formal repository? And by virtue of that accessioning process, you're also working out things like the legal ownership, some of the intellectual property, you're verifying the integrity of the model, and so forth. And with this, another very important part of curation is the deaccession process, which says, okay, many of you may remember, for example, lessons learned or knowledge repositories. There was a classic problem with these that they were perhaps very useful in the beginning, and all of a sudden things started getting out of date, and we never pulled these things back out of the repository. So model curation has to have a very active role of managing that collection and deciding when models, which may have been very useful, say, for repurposing for a period of time, are to be taken out of that collection for some particular reason. So that's just one of the activities that's involved in curation. And we have an active area of research where we're trying to define the full set of practices that are involved. I see longer duration models as having probably at least two natures. So the first is the model, and when I say model, it might be a collection of models, a composed set of models, where a model would be used throughout the whole life cycle, from initial concept through design, development, and then as we move forward in time and get more mature in our approaches, up into the operations, where we start to begin to have true digital twins. Digital twin meaning that the model coexists with the operational system, that the model receives sensor data from the environment and from the model itself, and so it's a very active exchange between them. So that is one type of model that will have much longer duration. The other is in models that are going to be reused, repurposed, and patterns being one of those, general models being another. And as time progresses, I think we'll see more and more of those in our enterprises, where we'll have a base type of model, which then we can look at the purpose and the context, and we can adjust those models and make them useful on additional projects. So a benefit of curation then is really that it has the potential to make models be capable of being effectively reused on future programs. And in order to do that, as we know, of course, we have to have metadata, and we have to have all the technical data that's associated with the model. And along with that, a pedigree. So these will be some of the elements that will help us to assess the fitness of model for another intended purpose and a new context. So model pedigree is something that's been around in the OR community, for example, for a long time now, since about 1980. This is the definition of model pedigree from Saul-Gass and Lampert-Joel, and that was originally called model demographics, and that may give you maybe a better sense of what model pedigree is about. I think it's a very important area for the systems community to start looking at and standardizing what do we mean by model pedigree. So whereas technical data can tell you all the things about credibility, it turns out that pedigree is much more important for whether we trust models. And in related research that my group has been doing over the past few years, we looked at the issue of model trust and making decisions with models. And it turns out that model trust has a lot to do with social factors, not just technical factors. And when a very senior decision maker wants to make a decision with a model, we found a pattern that happened where we had the modelers, we had the decision maker, and there was this through person. It was a trusted agent of a senior decision maker who would help to tell them whether to trust the model and whether it's worthy for making a certain decision. So what people often want to know when they use a model, sure, they want to know that there's good, credible data that's used with the model, that the model is verified for correctness, but they also want to answer questions such as who originated this model? What assumptions were there? How were decisions made? So if you think about pedigree and you think about the idea of longer term models, I like to think about it as kind of being a documentary. And in fact, we might even want to consider if there are alternative forms than just recording information. Maybe it's a video file that has the originator of the model, like really telling the story. Where did they come up with the idea? How were certain decisions being made? But this is a different artifact, if you will, than, say, the technical data. So model pedigree will be a very important part, I think, of those models that go into an enterprise repository of models that may be repurposed. Model curation can be thought of as something that's valuable at multiple levels of an enterprise, but the most power comes in when we can start to have curated collections at the top level of an enterprise. Today, in most of our enterprises, we see modeling competency often distributed across different individuals and programs, but we don't always strategically manage that. It's very difficult because there's no one there who really has that authority, who has that role. We also see that models exist across, say, many programs or business areas, but who is it that's going to have the big picture of what's possible to make applicable on a different effort? So this has all prompted us to start thinking about defining a new leadership role, an executive level leadership role of a model curator. You can think of this as, say, a museum, say an art museum. An art museum has a top-level chief curator, and they are responsible for everything that has to do with defining what pieces of art they might bring into their collection. They'll make sure they're authenticated. They put them under a process that ensures their care. They have archivists and so forth. So what would a model curator be at the enterprise level? Well, first and foremost, they're the ones who do decide what things come into the enterprise collection, and that is the role of accessioning. They would be the ones who do the valuation of models. As we get into a situation where we start sharing models with others, perhaps we're selling models to others or loaning models to others or borrowing. How do we put a value against these types of models that we're starting to produce? Strategic loan, this is not just the valuation of things, but also the intellectual property. And I know many of you are already experiencing the difficulties of working with partners who are also competitors and trying to understand how you might share models. And there are technologies, I think, on the horizon that will help us with this as well. Executive or enterprise level curator is also going to have sort of the master oversight role for the whole model collection. And by virtue of that, they're setting policies and ensuring that there are practices that are standard throughout the enterprise. The role also would be kind of being the champion or being the advocate for having very good technical strategies for how that collection is to be developed over time. And then a final role is really one that will be a very strategic one. If they know the whole collection, if they have knowledge of what the enterprise has in its repository, they can provide a leadership role in the creation of digital demonstrators or model demonstrators. And you can think of this as perhaps you're in a competitive situation and your organization is asked to demonstrate that you will have some new capability or vision for what a new system would be. And so the curator would help to reach into that repository and pull out the right kinds of models that can be composed in the right kind of way to demonstrate some future capability. So in our research, we've been working out all of these different kinds of roles, drawing from other fields of curation, and we've identified about 7 different forms that an executive level role might take depending on the nature of the organization. So our research for the year ahead, there are kind of 4 different priorities that we're looking at. First is around the practical implementation practices that will be useful, and these are companion practices to things like curation or configuration management. This doesn't intend to, for example, replace configuration management practice as it exists, but it's a companion to that. Second is to look at what I call the precursors, which are, we're already doing some of this stuff. What is the community doing? So we're trying to study this and look for where we have successful approaches and practices. And then we're looking into all of the social and technical barriers, enablers to curation. There's a lot of really interesting things to look at in the area of innovation. For example, if you have a curated repository of models, how could you use machine learning approaches to search your repository? How could you use blockchain to establish a trusted network by which you could trade models? So there are a number of these newer technologies in visual analytics and data science and so forth that will come to bear for the future of this field. And fourth is to continue our work in trying to look at the different competencies, roles, and responsibilities. So with that, I hope I've piqued your interest in this subject. The major sponsor behind this is the U.S. Department of Defense Systems Engineering Research Center, which by virtue of being an entity that has many collaborating universities, we have a lot of good kind of information to bring to maturing this area, but this is something that the wider systems community, I think, has a high interest and a role in helping to bring this forward to a more mature field. Thank you very much.